So good afternoon here in Tokyo. Good morning if you are following us online for this session of the T7 summit devoted to a very, very important topic and that we entitled A Matter of Peace, Security and Nuclear Non-Proliferation in a World of Polycrises and Interconnections. That's a little bit of a long title, but that reflects also something. It is the first time in this context of the T7 or even in the T20 discussions that we are really addressing frontline, grasping these issues of security, not just through development of climate-related risks, etc., but as such, as part of major geopolitical issues, foreign relations issues. And there was obviously one challenge for us, is that the community of think tanks that Tin Sonobe was referring to, or Ambassador Chino also this morning, in the context of the G7 or G20, are mostly dealing with development or with macroeconomic issues or with a number of socio-economic transformations. And we are not so collectively very well equipped to address something different, but which is also gathering a lot of very strong organizations, which are the issues linked with foreign affairs, for instance. And I remember that during the G20 Italy, for instance, at the end, EIE convened a meeting with the Council of Councils. And as I attended, for me, it was really two different worlds that were coming across, largely ignoring the assets of each another. So it's not really the first time something like this happens, but we are also very much convinced that instead of continuing to say, oh, there is the war in Ukraine and such conflicts, etc., we need also to get a sense of how to act on that and how to cross the lines between completely different sets of issues, ranging from precisely nuclear non-proliferation to peace building, peacekeeping, in terms of strategy, in terms of geopolitics, but in terms also of socio-economic issues in the background. So this is, in a nutshell, what drove us by setting up this session. We will start with the video message from Sibyl Bauer, who is Director of Studies for Armament and Disarmament at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And then on the panel here in person, Ettore Greco, the Executive Vice President of the Italian Institute for International Affairs in Rome. In the room we have Antonio Villafranca from ISPI in Milano, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, Director General of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in Delhi, India, who happens to be incidentally also the lead chair of the T20 India. Akihiro Takahara, professor at the University of Tokyo, and former director, JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development. Thank you very much for joining. Feliciano Guimarães has made it all the way from Brazil. He's the academic director of the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, one of the organizations that will be having the burden of organizing the T20 during the G20 presidency of Brazil next year, and a specialist also of international relations. Online, joining Nikolai Sokov from the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and hopefully, if he can connect, Bruno Tertrais, Vice Director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in France. So let me start by the recorded message of Sibyl Bauer, and then we will go into our panel discussion. Thank you very much again for joining. I'm Nicolas Bouchou with the Asian Development Bank Institute.
Hello. On behalf of SIPRI and the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, I'm sending best wishes and success to the G7 Think Tank Summit. It's held at such an important time for international peace and security. My name is Sibylle Bauer. I'm Director of Studies for Armament and Disarmament at SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and current chair of the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. In today's interconnected world, the topic of security and nuclear non-proliferation is of extreme relevance for all of us here and for the future of humanity more broadly. I'm often asked about my assessments of the world situation, about nuclear risks, about military uses of artificial intelligence. And indeed, we have moved on from a world where nuclear weapons seemed far away and where expert discussions focused more on scenarios of accidental use or miscalculation. Now you still have the risk of accidents or unintended escalation, but there are also fears of intentional use of nuclear weapons. But I think it's too easy to paint a gloomy picture, and I myself will remain an optimist as long as there are things that we can do, and I think there are many. We can invest in regional security, in dialogue, in the next generation, in education, in diversity, in equality. And we can connect across communities. That's something that is often said, but not so often done. Bridging gaps between academia and think tanks, between think tanks and the policy world, between natural and the social sciences, between different disciplines, between academia in different countries and different regions, and also between the silos of different technology areas. So how does nuclear, for example, relate to quantum, to artificial intelligence, to GTP chat, to cyber, to outer space, to conventional technologies? These are all very difficult but very important questions for arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. If I was asked to suggest one low-hanging fruit, so something that is very doable but would have very high impact, it is in the area of teaching. Strengthen arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament education in universities. These issues are taught at very few universities currently all over the world. I would also strengthen interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary education. And I would introduce mandatory courses in natural science faculties across the globe on security, on research ethics, societal responsibility, research, responsible research and innovation. So rather than dwelling on gloomy scenarios, let's look for things that can be done and move them forward. Thank you.
So, thank you, Sibylle. And let me also just, before I pass it on to iterate, the variety of subjects she has been touching on also reflects what was explored in the past few months in the task force on peace, security, and global governance in the context of the T7. And right after this discussion, we will have one other discussion about that task force. But let's, Ettore Greco, you are collaborating with Sibylle Bauer in the context of the EU Center. I never remember the exact title. The EU Center for Consortium, EU Consortium on Non-Proliferation. At this moment, we can see that international relations are tense. That it was mentioned this morning. Security issues are really tainting the overall G7 or G20 declarations. So what would be your vision at that moment regarding peace, armament, disarmament, but also in relation to what could be achieved through such convening arenas as the G7 or G20? The floor is yours.
So many thanks, Nicolas. And first of all, let me thank the T7 and the ADVI for inviting me and allowing me to take part in this very insightful and inspiring discussion. I would indeed try to say something more specifically related to arms control and what the G7 can do. I think the first thing that need to be underlined is the Japanese presidency has the great merit of having given a great prominence to arms control issues. And this could indeed be considered one of the most important and hopefully also lasting achievement of this year G7 presidency. It would be important, I would add, to place a specific emphasis on this aspect in the T7 final document. We will see, of course, what the final document of the G7 summit will produce, but for the moment, this is the concrete thing. It is important to underline that the document issued some days ago by the G7 Non-Proliferation Directors Group contains several demanding commitments, and I would say mark probably a further step toward the full incorporation of the non-proliferation and disarmament in the G7 agenda. I would say this is part of a wider trend towards an enlargement of the political agenda of the G7, which reflects two main factors. First, the growing difficulties in addressing security issues within the G20 due to the divergences of security challenges and of strategic relevance between the G20 members, and more broadly the deepening tension among big powers. And second, the interest of the G7 members in defining and also emphasizing common position on global securities issue vis-à-vis other major actors and their strategic rivals. However, G7 members must address a fundamental dilemma I would like just to emphasize. On one hand, they are actually rethinking and strengthening their deterrence posture and tightening the security and alliance ties between themselves to cope with the aggressive policy of Russia and what is widely perceived as China's hegemonic plans in Asia and elsewhere. On the other hand, the G7 members have at the same time a clear vested interest in consolidating and strengthening existing arms control and proliferation arrangement as treaty by, for instance, promoting their universal adoption, strengthening the control and monitoring system, and the enforcement mechanism to punish violators. This requires, of course, reaching out to other actors and developing a strategy aimed at expanding the groups of states that cooperate to achieve those goals and leave the door open also to cooperation with strategic rivals, including, of course, China and Russia. This is the basic dilemma that the G7 members are facing: how to reconcile the efforts to strengthen their deterrence capability with the continuing interest in preserving and possibly enhancing the arms control architecture. There are, we know, different views and sensitivities among G7 members regarding arms control issues, but also a strong convergence on some fundamental goals. It is relatively easy to reach a consensus on a couple of relevant initiatives. It was so in the past. I will mention the one promoted under the French presidency to counter the accelerating proliferation of ballistic and other missile technology. And these, of course, are much to do with the rising threats from North Korea and Iran. A second key objective is the start of negotiations, the one recommended by the UN General Assembly, on a treaty banning completely the production of fissile material that can be used for military purposes. On this issue, a fundamental divergence remains with China, which is the only NPT state that does not declare a moratorium on this type of production. And I will also mention the G7-led global partnership against the spread of weapons and material of mass destruction. All these signature initiatives of G7 relate mostly to the non-proliferation dimension. And the challenge is how to further promote them in the current worsening security climate. If we then take a broader perspective, we see two parallel diplomatic endeavors. The one is to explore options to launch a meaningful dialogue with the other key powers, including China and Russia, This dialogue is essential to reduce nuclear and other strategic risks. Risk reduction had become a serious and credible matter of discussion among the P5 before the beginning of the current crisis in war in Ukraine, but now the situation has changed. The key priority is now to avoid an escalation that may lead to a direct confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, but not less important is the dialogue with China to reduce nuclear risk in East Asia, and particularly in the context of the conflict over Taiwan. There is also a clear convergence within the G7 on the request that Russia restart the implementation of New START treaty, and that China produce greater transparency of its nuclear weapons policies and actual capabilities. It's part of a wider daunting challenges on how to associate China as a power with rising nuclear capabilities in risk reduction discussion, nuclear disarmament talks. But the G7 action in the non-proliferation arms control field is also essential to bridge the North-South divide. The dialogue with the so-called Global South will continue to revolve mostly, of course, about the non-proliferation regime. At last NPT review conference, the member states failed to reach a consensus on a final document due to Russia veto, but beyond that, we have witnessed growing tensions with non-nuclear states over the implementation of the NPT agenda, in particular its nuclear disarmament pillar. Realistically, what the G7 can do in the current situation is to try to give an impulse to international negotiation on some issues that remain crucial for the preservation of the NPT non-proliferation regime. One, for instance, is the enhancing of the safeguard system, which requires a stronger roles of the IAEA. Another goal is to increase the safety and security of nuclear facility, but it's also important that the G7 reiterate other positions on issues of central importance, for instance, for non-nuclear states, such as the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and its support for the nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East, which are established positions within the G7. Finally, a crucial topic I will mention in export control regimes, which is now an apple contest, which requires closer coordination, not only with the G7, but also with other states. And the parallel capacity, this will open a wider discussion, to update those regimes and strengthen those regimes in light of the rapid technological development. So this is a very demanding agenda, which will putting the serious test both the capacity of G7 to reach common position, also to reach out to other key actors in the field.
Thank you very much, Ettore, and probably the richness and the variety of issues which you have pointed out, from nuclear non-proliferation, including non-proliferation treaty, and Global South perspectives, include a range of intermediary issues which all deserve to be specifically looked at. The discussion today is obviously a very, very first mile in the context of the T7, to be further continued in the coming months, but hopefully also next year, when there will be the G7 Italy presidency. Ambassador Chinoi, you were listening carefully and probably thinking about also additional perspectives from the point of view of both your role as chair of the T20 India, but also your role as Director General of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So firstly, on the issue of this being an era of polycrises and interconnectedness, and I think that's a statement of a fact. When we look at the geopolitical situation today, we find a world in flux. We also find a world that is increasingly fragmented, but not quite fractured yet. but the interconnectedness is essentially along 6 axes. The first is trade, the second is technology, the third is territorial disputes, the fourth is terrorism, the fifth is tenets, as in narratives for social, cultural, economic, political governance, and the superiority that is claimed by one against the other. And the sixth is trust, or the utter lack of it. These are the 6 T's that provide the interconnectedness today in various geographies. The 2 main geographies that we are looking at today in a fractured world in flux are essentially the European theater, where the notion of European security and stability has been completely upended. It has been presented de novo as a result of the war in Ukraine. Simultaneously, we see the unraveling of stability and an absence of security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So therefore, I think we need to understand these 6 factors along both these geographies. And some of the players in this are common. So we have to keep that in mind. For me personally, I feel that several of these T factors, as I call them, are being weaponized also, but they are also providing the interconnectedness. For instance, trade and technology is being weaponized across the board today. Trade less so, because it is fungible and more difficult to control. It's more difficult to decouple from anyone today. But in the technology space, it is far easier to use export controls, sanctions, etc., especially in high-end items. We also see that territorial disputes are common to the Indo-Pacific and the European theater. Likewise, terrorism is not something that is simply a Middle East problem or a South Asian problem any longer. And when we look at tenets again, there is this whole debate about, liberal versus democratic, open and transparent, whereby we mean democratic and democracy, vis-a-vis authoritarian, autocratic regimes. So we see that in all this, in the din of this discourse, what we have lost is trust. And now, having said that, let me say that as far as the other issue is concerned, I'll make a few brief comments on arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. As far as arms control is concerned, this is essentially between the big boys, between the P5. And essentially, within the P5, it has been essentially between the United States of America and the erstwhile Soviet Union, and later the Russian Federation. Now here there are very disturbing signs, because the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972, as you all know, came to an end in 2002. And not only did it come to an end, but Russia also thereupon walked out of the START II treaty. The START I treaty, which in fact started a decade, 12 years prior to START II, around 1991, lasted until 2009. But START II came to an abrupt halt after about 7 or 8 or 9 years in 2002. We also see that the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, commonly known as the INF Treaty, came to an end in 2019 because the United States walked out of it. So when we are looking at now the remaining, just about floating New START treaty, the writing is on the wall that by 2026 you will need something dramatically new, and it's not quite happening. On the other hand, you brought out the fact of China, the concerns that Pentagon has expressed recently about China's enlarging its nuclear forces to take it to 1,000 ICBMs, etc. More relevantly, hypersonic missiles, which are going to be far more potent than the bombers and things like that that were covered by the START treaty. So it's a very complex world. As far as disarmament is concerned, let me say firstly, and I've got to be consistent, the G7 can do what it likes, the T7 can also do what it likes, but the only place where you can engage in negotiations for disarmament is the Conference on Disarmament, which is a full 65 members, including the 5 nuclear weapon states. So that's where the negotiations take place. They do not take place outside of the CD. That is the position that a country like India also takes, and many others. And in disarmament, what we have to see is that Article 6 of the NPT has never been acted upon. That is to say that, you know, in good faith, the nuclear weapon powers will engage in negotiations to rid the world of nuclear weapons. It's never happened. We must keep in mind that the CTBT, for instance, has also gone about it unilaterally in terms of having Annex 2 with 44 countries there. And ironically, countries that are not party to the CTBT have been listed there. It's a short formula for utter failure of the CTBT. It can never be operationalized, not just because there are countries that have not signed and yet listed there. That's like asking for pie in the sky. But there are also countries that have signed but not ratified, primarily the United States of America and China. So the CTBT, I think, is dead as a dodo. As far as the FMCT is concerned, a country like India would say we fully support the FMCT, but based on the existing Shannon mandate, which does not require to be tinkered with. As far as non-proliferation is concerned, I think the whole joke today for me is the fact that the nuclear weapon states, as in they happen to be permanent members. By the way, possession of nuclear weapons was never the criteria for becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council. In 1945, just one had nuclear weapons. This is something that permanent members have acquired because of their exceptionalism, because of a privileged status, and we have to recognize that. Now, as far as non-proliferation is concerned, the NWS states say, as recently as a year ago, in the beginning, I think 3rd of January 2022, that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, etc. And within a few weeks thereafter, in February, it's completely upended. You're talking about nuclear threats, you're talking about nuclear alert in Russia. Mercifully, the United States didn't follow suit. But you also now have the whole issue of tactical weapons and being stationed in Belarus, etc. But from our point of view, we have lived with non-proliferation, or rather proliferation, for a very long time. We have seen how Japan faces a twin proliferation threat in China and in North Korea. We have seen how India faces a twin proliferation threat, I'm afraid, in China and in Pakistan, and these are linked. We have Iran enriching to 83.5%. You have the North Koreans still, with bombs and missiles in their basement, going about their work merrily. And all this makes for a very, very complex world. So I think we are at a juncture where we have to take these issues very, very seriously. But I do believe that the G7 will not be able to truly try and build consensus, because not everybody who has nuclear weapons is in the G7. The G7 is not the UN Security Council. And in terms of disarmament, the UN Security Council is not the Conference on Disarmament. So it's a very complex issue. But of course, it's a free and democratic world. I don't think there'll be any space for this in the G20. And from the Think20 point of view, I can only speak to the subject from my limited perspective. But really, if bringing in geopolitical issues has been seen to be enough of a problem, you can imagine what it would do to consensus if you bring in disarmament and proliferation issues, some involving permanent members and some involving nuclear weapon states from the P5. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the frank and precise opinion sharing on the situation. Akio Takahara, with the view of Japan, and Japan also being in the position of chairing the G7 this year, how would you see both the sort of the overall situation, but the possibility or not, and if yes, how for arenas such as our T7 to bring a useful segment or useful value proposal in the discussion, which again is not only complex, but we understand that each and every bit of it has a number of potential consequences. So we are all dealing here with very hazardous material potentially. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you, Professor Sonobe. Thank you, ADBI, for having me here and for hosting this wonderful gathering of people. Now, the questions that we need to tackle are so serious, as we all know that we are in an era of compounded crisis, and the world is increasingly divided and precarious. And what I would like to argue first, under this condition, is that it is most vital to reconfirm the importance of human security for every single person in the world, that is, no matter which side of the division or divisions he or she belongs to. And I do believe this is where we should start our thinking on how to promote nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Now, what is human security? Is it important to discuss human security at this point of time? Well, about human security, I believe in the next session, Professor Mine, who's sitting there, will be elaborating further. But let me just say that the idea of human security is very simple in its essence, which is to preserve the lives, the livelihoods, and dignity of the people. And if we recall, it was about 30 years ago when the concept of human security emerged. That was very much related to the end of the Cold War, if you remember. The specter of World War III, yes, that would be fought to the detriment of humankind through the use of nuclear weapons. That was gone at that time. And people started to expect that we should receive the dividends of peace. But in fact, what happened was the eruption of serious internal ethnic conflicts that had been muffled under the Cold War regime, wasn't it? Then the concept of human security was introduced as a very innovative perspective for focusing on people rather than countries, and freeing the people from fear and want, and preserving the dignity of the people. But today, compounded crises pose multiple challenges to human security. In addition to natural disasters, climate change, and infectious diseases, and what have you, we all know about these very well. Violent extremism, internal armed conflicts, they continue threatening the human security of people in many countries in the world, as we see today, for example, in Myanmar and in Sudan. So needless to say, on top of the lists of threats that we must add the return of geopolitical conflicts. That is the war between nations, right? At this very moment, people's lives, people's livelihoods and dignity are destroyed brutally in Ukraine. And we are most concerned about the possible use of nuclear weapons there and serious damages to the nuclear power plant. So my point is, we should never forget that the preservation of national security is in fact a prerequisite for realizing human security. This leads me to emphasize a very basic point in the studies of politics, that is the need to prevent the abuse of power. Abuse of power by the power holders, both internal and international. At the end of the day, mechanisms for the check and balance of power based on established rules and shared ideas, these are imperative for human security, and for this we must start from the promotion of legal systems and legal minds in each country of the world. At the same time, don't we think it is time to revisit the question of reforming the United Nations and its Security Council, which has not met the expectations of the ordinary members of the international community? What are we to do when a nuclear-armed permanent member of the Security Council blatantly breaches the UN Charter and invades its neighbor, and the Council cannot stop the war? In terms of the threat of nuclear weapons, if you lived in this part of the world, that is East Asia, you'll be shocked by the repeated firing of missiles by the DPRK, which has been happening again and again and again in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And it is also reported that China is rapidly developing its nuclear arsenal, and that would push the United States to develop theirs with a view to maintaining parity with the arsenals of Russia and China put together. From the viewpoint of non-nuclear states, such as Japan, all of these are totally unacceptable. And I fully support the ideas in the message of the International Group of Eminent Persons for the World Without Nuclear Weapons, just published this month, to uphold and strengthen the NPT. Have you read the messages? If you haven't, I do really recommend you to read them. And they include ideas such as increasing transparency and accountability by establishing a process of discussing regular national reports submitted by NPT states parties, in particular the 5 nuclear weapon states. Now, almost 78 years have passed since the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what ordinary people of Japan think most basic and fundamentally important in revitalizing the NPT is to remember and engrave in our hearts the atrocious consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. I hope many more international conferences and summit meetings will be held in those 2 cities so that more people will see for themselves how science can go wrong and how brutally science can destroy people's lives, livelihoods, and dignity in a way that is beyond our imagination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for reminding what you mentioned last, that this is also irrigating significantly the vision of G7 Japan about nuclear non-proliferation and deterrence. And for anyone who has visited Hiroshima, for example, and the understanding of the capability of science to turn everything upside down is unbelievable. And this is also part of the equation, obviously. Thank you for reminding us about that. Let's now keep the same issues, but look at them from a different geography, that is from Brazil. Thank you, Feliciano, for joining us, specifically also for this session. Obviously, geography counts, but we are in an interconnected environment. So with that, plus having in mind prioritization of issues in preparation of G20 presidency of India, and with the president of Brazil, and with the president of Brazil being very active also on the global diplomatic stage, please share your views on the topic of today. And I know you have prepared, so just a word, Feliciano has prepared a long presentation. He will not use it fully, but this material will be made available for anyone who is interested after the session. Feliciano, the floor is yours, and then we will pass it on to our colleague Nikolai Sokov, who is patiently listening, taking notes, and I'm sure he will be eager to share also a few comments back in Europe. Feliciano, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to T7 and the ADBI for sponsoring my trip from the far side of the world to Japan. I'm still a little jet lag, 13 hours behind. So, but it's my first time in Japan. I'm enjoying very much. So thank you very much. My presentation is a little different from the theme. I warned Nicholas about that. This is, as Nicholas mentioned, a long presentation. I'm just going to focus on a couple of issues, which is Brazil's global aspiration under Lula administration that started in Brazil in January of this year, and it's going to be the administration hosted the G20, T20, and all the other 20s next year in Brazil. So as I mentioned, this is our 6 topics that I usually talk about when I talk about the foreign policy of Lula's administration. The reconstruction after 4 years of Bolsonaro administration that was very detrimental to Brazil's foreign policy, the reposition in South America, climate change, hedging strategy vis-a-vis the US-China competition, the political G20 proposed by President Lula in the war in Ukraine, and the hosting of the G20 due 24. I'm going to focus on the last 3 of those. So we cannot forget that Brazil's when Brazil hosts the G20 next year, we're going to be in a process of reconstructions of Brazil's position in the world. After 4 years of Bolsonaro administration, the country was isolated, a very conservative foreign policy. They had just a few friends in the world, and these friends were not countries themselves, but specific political leaders of specific countries. And this is very different now. So Lula administration has a very difficult task ahead for the next 4 years, not only the vast social problems that we have in Brazil, but also to reconstruct what the foreign policy means, right? To come back at least a little bit for what it used to be the traditional foreign policy of Brazil. And that involves repositioning Brazil in South America, right? One of the key issues about Brazil is to rejoin South America. During Bolsonaro administration, South America didn't exist, was not Brazil's priority, which is incredible to think about that. Brazil's priority during Bolsonaro was the white United States and the white America. It was a very conservative and narrow view what Brazil should have as a foreign policy. Now it's completely different. Climate change, which I'm going to talk about, the tackling the deforestation in the Amazon. We have a phrase in Portuguese that Amazon standing, Brazil is standing. So we need to work harder to keep the Amazon from deforestation, the vast deforestation that is happening, and the U.S.-China strategy. So this is the triple challenge: removing Bolsonarism from foreign policy, regaining credibility, improving international status of Brazil. And I'm gonna go into this. I'm also a professor at the University of São Paulo, so I need my presentation, so I can never work it out. So climate change, right? So the first issue of Brazil's foreign policy, one of the biggest challenges of Brazil is first to reject climate denialism that we saw during Bolsonaro. The deforestation of the Amazon increased dramatically in the 4 years of Bolsonaro. We have always to separate it, according to Brazilian law, there is legal deforestation and illegal deforestation. So you can't own land in the Amazon and have legal deforestation, but it's only 10% of the land there. But if you own land in the south of Brazil, you can deforest 90% of the land. So there is legal deforestation, but the vast majority of deforestation in the Amazon is illegal deforestation. Going over government-owned land. The government of Brazil owns 70% of the total land in the Amazon. There's many national parks, many indigenous lands, and the government owns them all. So in some states, the deforestation is going up to 80% of the forest already. So that's a big challenge, because in order to do that, you have to reconstruct the state of Brazil that was demolished during Bolsonaro administration. We saw that during Lula's participation in COP27 in Egypt, the reactivation of the Amazon fund, and now the Chinese, Europeans, and Americans are refunding after 4 years of freezing that happened during Bolsonaro. Brazil will host, and SEBRE is helping the Brazilian government to. SEBRE is the Brazilian Center of International Relations that I belong to. Is helping to host the World Amazon Forum in Belém, Pará, in October 2023. We're going to bring all the Amazon countries there, 7 Amazon countries, to Belém, which is a big city in the heart of the Amazon. And we're going to bring any other country that would like to help Brazil in the Amazon countries to tackle deforestation. We're pledging to host the COP30 in Belém as well in 2025. As the phrase, as I said in the beginning. So this is Brazil's biggest challenge in terms of foreign policy. It's you can only accomplish anything in the long term. There is no way you can accomplish in the short term, because the biggest challenge is to rebuild the state capacity to control cattle raising and farming in the Amazon. Most of the deforestation in the Amazon happens for cattle raising, because cattle raising is going up to the forest, if you're from the south of Brazil northwards, and it's very cheap, because all you need is to cut down the trees, and then you have pasture, and then you can just throw some cattle there, and then from the satellite sees the cattle, so this is property land now. So it's very easy for them to do that, but you can use the pasture just 1 or 2 times, and then you cannot use it anymore, because the land in the Amazon is is not good for either pasture or agriculture in general. It's a very poor ground, earth for this type of activities, right? So this is going to take a long time, and this is Brazil's biggest challenge in terms of foreign policy. But apparently the Brazilian government doesn't think that way so much, because maybe what you probably see in the news is, and I think that's more or less related to what the panel is about, is the Brazil's position on the war in Ukraine. I don't know if you follow the news about Brazil's position, but in the beginning of the war, Brazil condemned the invasion at the United Nations Security Council. Brazil is not a permanent member, is a temporary member now. But Brazil has also condemned the unilateral sanctions against Russia. The bilateral relationship between Brazil and Russia is very complicated. Brazil is one of the bread baskets of the world. We export food to 1 billion people in the world nowadays. We're the #1 exporter of beef, the #1 exporter of soybean, #2 in maize, even wheat. In a country that is a tropical country, in the past was very, very difficult to plant wheat in Brazil. Now Brazil is exporting wheat. It's not exporting, but it's almost totally independent in wheat production. But the problem is that we don't have fertilizers. We have the fertilizer on the ground, especially potassium, but we never drilled the fertilizer because it was much cheaper to buy from Russia. And the companies that were doing that in Brazil were owned by Russian billionaires. So now 80% of our potassium, for example, comes from Russia. So in every bilateral relationship with Russia, Russia uses that as a pressure against Brazil. That's one of the reasons Brazil has adopted this ambiguous or more pro-Russia position, both in Bolsonaro administration and also in Lula administration. It's not only a matter of how Brazil sees the world, but there is a structural problem that forces Brazil to have a closer relationship with Russia. I remember when the beginning of the war, everybody was saying that Germans will have a problem in the winter because they will have to, they're importing gas, not only Germans, but a lot of countries in Europe, they're importing gas from Russia, but in 1 year, the Germans apparently solved the problem. So we cannot solve this problem in 1 year in Brazil. It will take up to 10 to 15 years to be able to replace the dependence in Russia. And the Brazilian government is not working hard in that regard because it's still very cheap to buy from the Russians. So if you look at Russia, it used to be Brazil's 10th biggest trade partner. Now it's Brazil's 5th trade partner. So that happened during the war, right? So what happened is that, and then if you look at right at the beginning of Lula's administration, you see President Lula saying that Brazil wants to mediate the war in Ukraine. And that goes back to a traditional problem about Brazil's foreign policies that we can never answer. Is Brazil a middle power or is Brazil an emerging power? Is Brazil more like India or is Brazil more like Argentina or Egypt or Mexico? Most of Brazilians would like to be like India, a rising power everybody recognizes as such. But that, in the position of Brazil in the war in Ukraine, shows the dilemma. Because if you are a middle power, if you see yourself as a middle power, you don't go to try to mediate the war in Ukraine because it's too far away. You don't have the capacity, the material capacity to do that. It's very difficult to convince the Brazilian people that Brazil should get involved in mediating a war that nobody knows exactly how far it goes, right? But if you are an emerging power, if you see yourself as such, you have to discuss every international issue on the agenda, especially the war in Ukraine. Because we are a member of the BRICS, we have easier access to the Chinese authorities and the Russian authorities. It was easier for Brazil, as it is easy for India as well, to be able to put itself as a mediator in the war. And the backlash of this position domestically, not only internationally, but domestically in Brazil is tremendous, right? Now there is a damage control operation in the part of Brazil, both in Europe and the United States, trying to say, look, Brazil, we put ourselves in a mediating in a position of mediator, but it was not that much. We don't want that much anymore. So Brazil is already backtracking because the cost of adopting such position is enormous because it affects all the other issues that we have to rebuild in Brazil. For example, the position we take in the war in Ukraine affects our capacity to bring all the resources we need to tackle the deforestation in the Amazon. So there is a lot of discussion in Brazil about, which I perceive as a flop decision-making process in the beginning of Lula's administration. There was no planning. For example, there is no plenipotentiary ambassador. There is no exit strategy. And now they're trying to come up with this damage control operation. I have been studying public opinion and foreign policy for my entire academic life. And for the Brazilian people, if the Chinese, the Indians, or the Japanese recognize us as an emerging power, they don't see that as important. For the Brazilian people, Americans and Europeans have to recognize us as an emerging power. In the mindset of the average Brazilian, the prestige and the status resides in the United States and Europe, and not in India or in China. So any foreign policy that goes too far away towards China or too far away toward India, for example, has a domestic cost, because Brazilians in general, the people, will see it in negative terms. And that goes to the other issue, which is how Brazil position itself in the U.S. and China competition, right? So the general idea here, both in Bolsonaro, but especially in Lula administration, that we have to adopt a hedging strategy, which is common to many other countries in the world, which is come up with a sophisticated foreign policy in which you have to do bandwagoning and balancing simultaneously with both China and the United States. And Lula visited the United States right after the beginning of the administration. Now he just visited China. The agenda, the visit in the U.S. was democracy and regional policy, and the agenda on when Lula's visit Xi Jinping was trade, investment, and technology cooperation. But the baseline is that the United States, in terms of economic gains and trade gains and investment gains, the United States of America doesn't have much to offer to Brazil as compared to China. China has way more to offer. He offered in this visit, right? And it has much more to offer in the future. But the United States has a problem, which not only concerning Brazil, but entire Latin America, is how to tackle the Chinese increasing influence in the region without having the resources that the Chinese have for that. So when it comes to the G7 and the G20 in Brazil, we frame it in a different way. We talk about BRICS and G7. So Brazil is not a member, BRICS and the OECD. Brazil is not a member of the OECD. Brazil applied to be a member of the OECD. Now the administration is discussing if you're going to be a full member or not. But Brazil is also a member of BRICS. So Brazil might be the only country in the world that is going to be both a member of BRICS and a member of OECD if Brazil goes that far. And just to finalize, the last issue, which is hosting the G20 in Brazil for 2024. So SEBRI, it's one of the official think tanks that is going to be organizing the T20 for 2024. It's an opportunity to show a new Brazil under Lula administration. So the government will have to will use the G24 as a showcase of the new Brazil. And the most important issues so far that the government is talking about that is going to be key for the G20 in Brazil are going to be climate change, democracy, gender balance, fight against discrimination, and food security. So as you can see, there is not if you look at food security as a security issue, you can see that way. But security in itself, for Brazilian government, it hasn't shown as an important issue yet. Maybe this is part of the backtracking of the strategy in Ukraine. You know? So as far as now, we're not going to believe we're going to have such a wealthy organization like the Indians have, a huge organization for the G22, or neither a modest organization like the Argentina had in 2018. So we're going to try to mimic what Indonesia had in 2021, which is in between these two. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to show you a little bit about Brazil's new administration foreign policy, and I'm looking forward for the question. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was thinking, your description is a lot about the complexity of driving transformations or taking stance in a very interconnected world, and that cannot be better reflected than the case of the Amazon and connecting the different range of issues. But referring to also what Ambassador Chino was mentioning, for example, about disarmament, there is a conference on disarmament. Let's have the conference on disarmament, talk about disarmament, and not have these kind of issues being discussed in so many other arenas which are far less legitimacy to address that. I think this is the exact kind of endpoints or points for us to circulate during our discussion this afternoon. And I'm very, very interested and thankful to Nikolai Sokov, who has been passionately listening to us in Vienna. He's one strong specialist of disarmament and non-proliferation, and as the Vienna Center is. So we are circulating against geography back to Europe as a last mile of today's exploration and discussion about a matter of peace. Nikolai, we briefly agreed that you could comment on any of the perspectives which were brought up by either Sibyl in her opening remarks or Ettore Greco, Ambassador Chinoy, or Akio Takahara or Feliciano. And also you might want to bring more specifically your views on the immediate priorities regarding these issues of non-proliferation or disarmament, but especially in light of what G7/G20 can do. The floor is yours, Nikolai.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not in Vienna, by the way. Yes, I'm in Washington right now. So yes, I'm even further down the globe, and it's the middle of the night. But it's really a pleasure to talk to this audience and to be part of such an eminent panel here. I will not comment on the statements by others. A lot already has been said. I think the participants to the panel have really characterized very well the deep crisis that we now live through. Also, yes, arms control is in deep crisis. Well, in fact, but has a very strong personal meaning to me, because I spent really my life in the past. When I was a diplomat, I spent many years negotiating various arms control treaties, the INF treaty, START 1 treaty, START 2, other international agreements, and really all of them have already now disappeared. So at the personal level, that's really very sad, actually, feeling, because that's what I did my whole life. And yes, it's very unfortunate. So yes, arms control is out. The non-proliferation regime, which really is the foundation of international security, of the international system as we know it, is also under very significant stress. Yes, of course, the nuclear threats by Russia in the course of its war against Ukraine affect the non-proliferation regime, but in fact, not just that. As we know, there is a very strong international movement supported by many countries to eliminate nuclear weapons as soon as possible, right? The TPNW, the treaty, on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, has already entered into force. But of course, the nuclear weapon states, both those that are both in the non-proliferation treaty and outside it, do not support it. So yes, that's a very serious, actually, contradiction that is fraught with very serious conflicts that potentially could undermine the non-proliferation regime. We have 5 nuclear states inside the non-proliferation treaty and 4 states outside it. Just imagine what happens if only one more state in the world acquires nuclear weapons. That will have 5 and 5. So yes, that's really not healthy. So I think an urgent action is needed here. What can we do? What can G7 and G20 do? Well, it would be quite easy to adopt a declaration to tell Russia to return to the new START treaty and conclude the new treaty. well, it would be quite easy to do other kind of statements and things like that. But will it work? Yes, and that's the big problem. The problem of nuclear weapons, really fundamental problem associated with nuclear weapons, is that the consequences of nuclear weapons are global, but decisions are made nationally. So unless you get a nuclear weapon state to agree to eliminate nuclear weapons, or unless a nuclear weapon state agrees to enter negotiations, nothing will really happen. Why we keep having nuclear weapons and why we keep having this problem? Well, then let me actually, a lot of things were commented today and listed, a lot of challenges, but let me try to wrap it up. We managed, by we I mean the world, managed, without quite actually noticing that, enter a new systemic conflict. That's really about the future of the international system. It's not a systemic conflict. Well, it's not. Well, it's not the first systemic conflict in history. But before the nuclear era, such systemic conflicts came to be resolved through large-scale wars. But in the presence of nuclear weapons, of course, you cannot have such a war. So you have a long-drawn, primarily economic, political, and so on and so forth conflict. Sometimes you have some limited wars. Yes, I'm actually concerned that the war that we see today in Ukraine is only the first war in a series of similar conflicts in the coming years. What the systemic conflict is about? The systemic conflict is about pretty fundamental things. Who makes the rules in the international system, and who decides on the application of these rules? Yes, of course, we all know, yes, and we all agree that Russia committed a major violation of UN Charter by invading Ukraine. What actually no one mentioned out on the panel, then usually we just don't talk about that. But it's the fourth violation of UN Charter since the end of the Cold War. We just don't talk about them because, well, it's acceptable. Sometimes you can violate UN Charter, and sometimes you cannot violate UN Charter, right? So yes, that's basically, in a nutshell, the conflict that we live in. And can we get rid of nuclear weapons? Well, I guess as long as we live in that conflict, no, we cannot. And also, yes, we can make calls, but I don't really think it'll be possible to get nuclear states get rid of nuclear weapons. So what can we do? And what the immediate task of G7 and G20 is with respect to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I think the most immediate task is actually to make sure that the non-proliferation regime is not blown up by the conflicts, by disagreements that have haunted it for like 2-3 decades. And we all know that. For example, it's about the nuclear-free zone in the Middle East and other issues. Yes, and it's okay to have these disagreements. It's just important to make sure that these conflicts and disagreements do not explode the regime as a whole.
Nikolai.
Yes.
Yes. Nikolai, thank you so much for this overview, this very comprehensive overview. And I think one very, very important element you mentioned is first, it could be discussed, but first, systemic conflict in the era of nuclear weapon makes things both.
Second, actually.
You say first, second, okay, but make things.
The Cold War was the same thing. It ended. Now we're in a new one.
So yes,
Sad.
and that's a very important dimension of the current conflict. So we have just a few minutes left, and I think we have portrayed both the sheer complexity of this polycrisis and interconnections when we really want to address them according to existing normative patterns, be it nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, and other arenas of negotiations. So in the next 4.5 minutes, not to get to any kind of conclusion, but if there is any remark from the floor, if anyone wants to share a thought, but very briefly, and then whoever from the panel wants to share a word of conclusions is more than welcome. I would like to thank very specifically Nikolai, because if you are in Washington, it must be near 4 a.m. in the morning, between 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning. And that's quite a commitment for you to join at such a night time. Thank you all the more. So very briefly, in 2 minutes, if you have a remark, introduce yourself. You have the mic at the back and in the front, please.
Bueno, do you want to go first?
Oh, but you have, okay, in 30 seconds.
Okay. So my name is Lorena Gomez. I'm from Colombia. Let me stand up. So thank you very much for all the different insights. I definitely think in a time of climate change, we need to think more about dialogue and conflict management at the local level and then in an international level. And I think my remark has to do with what is underneath all these conflicts, because sometimes we talk about negative war, negative peace, but we really need to think about positive peace. So maybe some of you are familiar with the pyramid of hate, which starts with bias and stereotypes, and that scales up. So my basic comment is, these wars are only the surface, it's the exploding side of something that has been underneath, the undercurrents. And in these undercurrents, there's a lot of ethnic conflict, let's say between China and the Western world. There's a lot of resentment. And behind that, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma. And that's where my comment goes to. Like, I would invite people studying peace to understand the collective trauma we are carrying from the past, as they were mentioned from Japan, but it comes from generations. Because if we don't solve that at that level, it's very difficult to stop conflict.
Thank you very much. The underlying factors, and you have got really, I mean,
Okay, my name is Jenny Bobo. I'm from the Philippines. There are a group of analysts who actually say that Ukraine made a fatal mistake of giving up its nuclear weapons. Russia would have hesitated to attack Ukraine if it's a nuclear power. So, given that, in view of that, how do you make the NPT agenda more relevant in the post-Ukraine world, or what kind of tweaks or changes that could be introduced to make it more relevant and applicable?
Thank you very much. So, 2 questions or any final notes? Maybe we start with Ettore, then Ambassador Chinoy.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
So very, very telegraphic. First of all, I would suggest that concerning the main source of the current instability and security challenges, I would mention essentially this global shift in the shift in global power, and the fact that down there are some powers that are trying to challenging the current order. This is the case of China, which is a rising power, and other powers that are resisting this move. And of course, we are now witnessing a revanchist Russia in Europe that is trying to pursue an agenda that clearly put into question basic pillars of the European order. So that's the problem. There is a strategic structural rivalry that is centered, of course, on US-China antagonism, but there are also this challenge from Russia. Just a point to respond to to the ambassador, of course, it will be impossible to overestimate the role of the G7 it's possible to overestimate the role of G7 in promoting the arms control agenda. Because it's a global agenda, there are specific forums to discuss arms control issues, of course, but this applies to many other global issues on the table, on the G7 table. What the G7 can do is just give the political impulse. And I'm mentioning the concrete steps that can be promoting. It's impossible to see, of course, the G7 as the driving force behind arms control treaties, but this applies to many other global issues. So I will just stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador
Take a
Chinoy.
few seconds?
Yes.
Very cryptically, Ms. Gomez's points, I think the root cause, the underlying cause of all these major disputes is essentially great power exceptionalism combined with a complete mismatch between the political, economic and military changes in terms of balance of power and the complete inability of the existing global order to respond to those changes. As far as the NPT is concerned, firstly, it is not universal. Secondly, it is flawed. Thirdly, it has been violated by adherence to the NPT multiple times. Fourthly, the nuclear weapon states have never begun in good faith or in bad faith something that was intrinsic to the NPT. That is to say, negotiations in good faith on general and complete disarmament. That's not happened. So I guess it's again a chimera to imagine that you can universalize the NPT in the post-Ukraine era. We aren't quite there yet. As you know, we are still in the middle of that war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have to wrap up, but Dr. Klat, is it okay? We can wrap it up with that. So thank you so much. Warm round of applause for the speakers this afternoon. Nikolai, thank you very much for taking the trouble to cut your night in two and joining us here. And the sessions continues here in this room and in the next room. Thank you very much also for the questions.